Hello, everyone out there in our badminton community. Welcome to another episode of the Badminton Podcast. Whether you're a first-time listener or you've listened to us frequently, we just want to say thanks so much for tuning in. My name's Jeff, and I'm your co-host, and this over here is Henry.
Hi, everyone.
Now, we're the co-founders of Volant as well, the brand that gives the world versatile badminton apparel and a better alternative to that unsightly, bright-coloured patterned clothing that you usually see. So you can wear your clothing everywhere. You can wear it down the street. You can wear it at the gym. You can wear it out with confidence and with pride. You make sure you do check us out then on www.volantwear.com. There's heaps of free resources there that can help you with your game as well. You can also follow us on our social media. Our handle is @volantwear, VOLANTWEAR. Now, we're really excited to be here and to share with you another episode of our podcast where we've got someone really cool for you to meet. So, look, the idea of the podcast is to really bring the badminton community together and to really hear the stories of different players around the world from all different lifestyles, from all different levels, and so that you can get some information that will hopefully push you to grow as both a player and a person. But before we get started in today's episode, we just want to give out a shout out to Winnie Wong. This is her second shout out because she did become a VIP Patreon and she's helping to support the podcast. So for those out there who would like to also support the podcast and get your own shout out, we'd love to hear from you and would love your help. This podcast is basically just fully funded by Henry and myself, and it's just from our full-time jobs. And we absolutely love doing it, but that's why we're asking for your support so that we can keep releasing regular high-quality episodes. So all you need to do is just pledge a tiny amount per month, and that can really help us with that. So hoping to hear from you. All you need to do is go to patreon.com/thebadmintonpodcast, and the link will be in the podcast description. So over to Henry now to introduce our awesome guest for today.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And for those of you watching the video podcast, our new guest is on, I think he's on my right, which I'm pointing there, unless he's below, depending, or maybe even on that side here. Either way, today's guest is Andrew Dabeka. Andrew spent all of his teenage and adult years immersed in the sport of badminton, which we love. Through his playing career, he won 6 Canadian men's singles championships, was ranked 20th in the world, 2-0, and represented Canada at the 2008 Olympics. Since his retirement as an athlete in 2009, he has worked as a coach, first in Switzerland from 2009 to 2013, and then in Canada from 2013 to 2019. Now he's back in Switzerland, again working with Yonex Switzerland as the head pro for their 2 badminton halls in Zurich. Welcome to the Badminton Podcast, Andrew.
Thanks very much, guys. It's a real pleasure to be invited.
Awesome. So let's
really
get
excited to have you on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's been a little while since I'd seen you. I saw you last year at the World Championships, Andrew, which was awesome. But previous to that, it was the 2008 Beijing Olympic run, which I would have seen you previous to that. And it was a fun time, and you made the Olympics. I didn't. Congratulations.
Yeah, that's probably a little bit of a bittersweet subject, I guess, from your side. I mean, you weren't far away from what I remember.
Yeah, it wasn't far at all, but that's okay. This podcast isn't about me today. It is all about you for today. So, Andrew, would you mind just telling us about your badminton history, where you started, and basically what the progress has been since then until now?
Okay, that's a big question.
It's a loaded question.
Take your time.
Yeah. So I mean, from my side, I started probably like every other badminton player, international badminton player, in terms of in my early teens, I picked up the racket for the first time and fell in love with the sport, and had some wonderful role models around me. In my club, we had several former Olympians who were involved. And so I was having an access to a pretty high level of badminton that I could, a couple of those athletes were still competing at the time. So, as a 12-year-old, I basically was able to watch fairly high level badminton. And I think that was a key to kind of developing some of the higher level skills from a younger age. I sort of started when I was just turning 14, going into grade 9. And it was an immediate, I got the bug immediately. And my life was sort of going in the sports path in general. I mean, I had always been good at sports and loved sports and played sports in every free moment of my day. So badminton gave me this kind of an organized environment for me to excel. Previous to that, it was just playground sports that I had done. And badminton really kind of that combination of my coach and his wife and his ex-doubles partner, them being all around, we were able, I was able to sort of see the path that it is possible. And that was sort of the start.
Yeah, certainly really, it's certainly really important to be able to be around badminton players who are successful and actually see that success is a possibility. Because I think for countries like ours in Australia, where success isn't that common in a sport like badminton, it's hard to see that the pathway exists. So it's great that you were able to have that exposure to such high-level badminton at that age. And I guess from you said you started at 14, Andrew. When did you get from a humble young man learning how to play badminton to an international athlete? What happened between that point to I guess where you are now?
Well, my first sort of big professional sports vision that I had as a youngster was watching Michael Jordan playing in those glory years of the Chicago Bulls, and watching some, over several years, a lot of those finals and playoff matches and games. And, that was really kind of the first, inspiration, let's say, that, hey, that's fun. That looks like a lot of fun and I want to be that. So, starting badminton, it was actually from day one that I was really, I wouldn't say it was my, my initial vision that, hey, I'm going to take badminton. This is going to be my sport, and I'm going to take it, as far as I can go. It was more, a friend asked me to join the badminton club, and I love sports, so I just joined the club with him. And then I, after that, found that inspiration of watching my coach and those players that I mentioned playing and training, and that I sort of said, I can do that, and that was, I think, some of the sort of initial, the initial click that kind of happened was like a lot of the stuff they were doing, I could sort of do, at least in my head, and I could sort of visualize that, hey, I can do that shot, and I can try that, and I can hit hard. If you're an athlete, you sort of have that ability to use your body to generate power. And so it was, I don't mean to come across as overconfident in any way, that, hey, right from day one, I was going to achieve something in badminton, but it was definitely sort of, that pathway and that excitement of watching them. I mean, they were at the tail ends of their career. I think the last event was Commonwealth Games in Victoria, and perhaps 1994, 95, somewhere in that area. Maybe even 96 Olympics. Mike Bitton, my coach, his wife Doris Piche, she competed in the 96 games in Atlanta. So, I was around them while they were, going for those big events. And so that pathway, Henry, was basically a little bit of that guidance from them, and that trying to just reproduce sort of and say I could do that. And with a lot of support, it helps when a coach is seeing your talent and sort of saying you can do it. I mean, that was definitely that helps kind of spur you on even more. And so that pathway basically was after that was just a couple of years of just trying to do as much badminton as I could. I mean, I was literally every day after school finished, I would be at the club at 4 p.m. and then I would be just hanging around. We'd have a junior program just after school for 3 days a week or 4 days a week. And Mike saw that I was super motivated and keen. And so he just basically, as the adults were rolling in to come play in the evenings, he would just put me into different games and matches with different people, and I was able to get just a ton of experience from playing a lot of different people. And I remember a couple of years doing these junior tournaments on the Canadian circuit and not being successful, but kind of progressing. And that was also pretty cool. You know, the first time that I had a close match with one of the top players who had been, you know, these guys had all been playing for like since they were 10 years old or 8 years old or 9 years old, a lot of them. And so it was like skill wise at that point, I was definitely not on the same level, but physically wise and you know, in terms of my sporty background, you know, there was enough tactical sense and tenacity and fitness and power that kind of went into some of those early successes. And after a couple of years, my coach and I, Mike Bitton, we basically made the decision to try to win the nationals and try to go down that path. And so it became a bit more refined in terms of what do I need to do to win. And that was what the kind of conversation was about. Like, and all of those experiences in the couple of years previous kind of showed me that, you know, I basically need more skills and athletics, but still trying to utilize as much of my athleticism as possible. So we kind of kept it a really simple game plan in terms of just keep the game basic, use the power, and have very good quality with the basic game and consistency, and just utilize, you know, this strength and fitness that I had to be successful. So that's sort of the starting point. And then I won in my last year of under 19. I won the junior nationals, and then after that, I was an adult and playing in the sort of senior category, in the open category, and from there it kind of went forward. And there was a couple of interesting years right after juniors where, you know, as every elite athlete probably knows, the transition to playing adult badminton is hard. It's definitely you know, you're now playing against people who are possibly 5 or 6 or 7 years older than you, who have 7 years more experience than you, and so that was really a challenge. And there was a couple of shaky years, but I think we laid the foundation that, you know, at the age of already, before I was playing in the open category, I mean, I was already playing a ton of these adult tournaments. And I think my first international tournament, we went to the US Open, which at that time was considered like one of the top tournaments in the world. I think that year, that was 97. So the 1 year after Paul-Erik Hoyer-Larsen had won the Olympics in 96 in Atlanta, and he competed there, and Peter Gade was there. I believe he beat him in the final. And, you know, there's all these top players from all around the world at that tournament. So, you know, I guess I was 18 or something like that, or 19 then. I was there watching, training alongside these people. So that was pretty inspirational. And that sort of, you know, was laying this foundation of building more and more skills and understanding of what it was to be an international badminton player. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can really resonate with you. Just kind of going back to your story, which was that you had some people to help you from the very start who, one, had the experience, two, they were role models for you because they had competed at Commonwealth Games, Olympic Games, and everything like that. And basically, yeah, I was in a very similar situation that my coach played at the Atlanta Olympic Games as well. His name was Paul Stevenson. And I was very lucky to have that kind of thing where I was part of a junior squad. And then he could see that I was really eager to learn and eager to train. And then I used to have private sessions with him. And then that kind of built that base up. And then once you have someone in your corner like that, it's a lot easier. I wouldn't say easier, but you feel you're a lot more supported to keep taking the steps. So that it sounds like that they played a really important role in your development as a young badminton player and then progressing through as well. So shout out to them if they're listening, just saying thank you from... I'm sure you've said a thank you a million times like I have to Paul, but thank you to them for giving you that exposure and that belief and that training at such a young age. So, Andrew, as we move on now through your professional career and into the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games, and then after that as well, when you started transitioning from a player to a coach, what was that like for you? And was that an easy decision, or did you think that you'd go into something outside badminton, or you always wanted to stay within it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My parents are both My dad has his PhD in chemistry. My mom, her master's in chemistry. And so the academics were pretty important growing up. And that was always a bit of a pressure. I mean, I should try to balance the rigors of schooling and the stability that a more, let's say, normal job might offer. So there was obviously into my later playing career years, they realized that that's Andrew's just doing his thing, he's being fairly successful, and so they sort of let me move, and that was definitely my focus, was just to do the badminton. And thinking a little bit about after badminton, after a few years, I just thought coaching would be sort of the smoothest transition, let's just say, to utilize whatever skills I had gained in the previous decade. And so it was a fairly easy choice. There was the odd day where I'm looking at some of my friends who now have houses and cars and families, who are 30, and I had spent all my money traveling over those many years. And so, I'm sure they were looking back at me saying, oh, what a fun life Andrew has. So there is always a bit of that where, thinking about having a normal quote unquote job, and studying for something else was there was a bit of a side thought for that. But in the end, it was just sort of, that was, let's just say, a lot more work than just jumping into the coaching, because I had all this expertise for badminton. So I had been doing a lot of coaching and mentoring through my later years. You probably remember David Snyder, one of our top athletes. He's 10 years younger than me, and so he was the super talent coming on. Alex Pang, the same thing.
Yep, Alex as well.
Who were just they were that next generation of men's singles players coming up from Canada, and so I did a lot of mentoring, especially with Dave, and there was just a foundation of being able to pass on that knowledge to the next generation. So that was quite smooth. And I got this opportunity to come to Switzerland and coach and actually play in a club as well. So there was this kind of dual income coming in from playing in the Swiss league and also being able to work with the national team of Switzerland. And that went from there.
It really sounds like a really smooth transition that you've had, Andrew. I would think that speaking to other sort of players turned coaches, usually some sort of more complicated pathway, and a lot of additional, thoughts that they'd have, and challenges that they'd have to overcome to go from a player to being a coach. Was there any sort of big challenges that you faced, or was it really just sort of the next step for you, given that you had all that sort of mentoring experience as a part of that transition?
Yeah, honestly, were there challenges? Absolutely, there were some, but for the most part, it was just, and what those were, I would say, quite minor from my side. It was just what level to coach, how to coach. There's only limited in Canada. There's only limited coaching opportunities. So everyone's sort of vying for, waiting for that pro who might retire, and hoping that there's an opportunity that opens up at that club. And there was, of course, the common thing that's happening around many parts of the world, I think, which is ex-athletes opening up their own clubs and starting their own programs out of warehouses. That's a popular one here in Canada. I'm not sure how it is in Australia, whether warehouse space has been converted into badminton gyms. Does that happen there?
Yes and no, but I wouldn't say that it's ex-pro players or professional players that do that. It's more just people who love badminton, or they want to invest in it. I wouldn't say it's that professional players do that like as a regular thing. No.
Yeah. So for me, those were a bit of the challenges were what would I jump into, and this opportunity in Switzerland really happened quite easily. Over the years, I had like all of us who have traveled, we have a lot of friends that we meet on the tour, and so this was sort of through a former player here in Switzerland who kind of helped arrange that opportunity here. And so so actually, Henry, it was really it was really quite a smooth and easy choice for me. I mean, as I mentioned, there were, little tinkerings of thoughts, but the path of least resistance was definitely to utilize my skills. And, I love people and I love working with people, which is, ironic because most of us singles players are more of the introverted types, with the exception of Jeff. I think he's one of the few real social...
social butterfly.
Social types. But the typical idea that you get about doubles players is those are the team players. Those are the team sport guys who are more into the social thing. I mean, obviously there's tons of exceptions, but the singles players are much more of, I think, an introverted. You're just happy to work on your own, and you don't answer to anyone. You just sort of. But I was definitely, always loved coaching, the little bits of coaching I did here and there to help raise money for my own badminton during my career. And so, that was just an easy transition.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. And now if we kind of move along to the thing we wanted to really talk about today, Andrew, that we've spoken about previously. You've been involved basically with high-level badminton for so many years, so both as a player and as a coach. And it's something that we just want to dive into a little bit today. So if we're going to just start with an introduction to this term of high-level badminton, what are the ins and outs of it? So how do you get there? How do you stay there? And how do you keep improving your game even though you're already there? So let's just say you've already developed your high-level badminton. How do you stay up there and how do you keep getting better and better?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. And I think the key to that, I mean, badminton, as we know, is such a technical game. I mean, you get any sport person to try badminton and, they'll be able to do well. They'll be able to get the idea of how to make your opponent, how to win the points. You have to put the shuttle on the floor. You have to make your opponent get out of position. And, but it is so technical, and it's that kind of, and I, at least from in my opinion, it's something that, if you go to somewhere like China or Indonesia or Denmark, and you see what level of teaching the kids are getting at the very first time they're touching the rackets. I mean, the detail is just so much more intricate, and, it's really that foundation, I don't know all of Victor Axelson's story, but I mean, I am quite positive that as a 12-year-old, he already had fairly high-level world-class technique with whatever skills he had been taught at that point. And assuming he played at that time, I'm assuming he did, but who knows? He might have been a late starter as well. I think so. Yeah, exactly. So basically, I think it's really starts with this foundation of having a broad skill set and a very high level of technique within that. So, skill set, all the different shots that you can develop. I always, in my coaching, always use the example that my granny, if she played badminton with, this panhandle grip, she might have been very good at the certain shots she could do. So she could execute them pretty flawlessly, but I mean, the technique just didn't allow for her to do a lot of variation. So it's kind of like there's the skill set and then there's the technique, that kind of, and bridging those together. And, as we see at the top level, there's many different individualities that go into the technique, but there are some common elements about the preparation and how quick the stroke can be delivered through that preparation, and how many from those different positions under pressure you're able to deliver enough variation with a certain amount of deception that doesn't look like you're now going to hit it cross court, when you're leaning back, and so the opponent doesn't have that. They're not able to read the game as well, and so it's all of these factors from these different parts of the court that go into the players being able to reach the very, very highest level. And that's is there a scientific journal that can concisely put that all together? Unfortunately not. And that's where badminton is really, really interesting. And I think all high level sports are, because it's you have the research that is sort of being done by some academics and some really keen people in behind, but it's really at the forefront of the coaches and the players who are there. And they're, as you mentioned, once you're there, how do you improve? How does Tai Tzu Ying and Carolina Marin and Michelle Lee, how are they approaching the next year? And this was for me a really interesting thing that happened. I mean, horrible that the Olympics had to be postponed, but it's now just such a unique situation, because what do these players who were on track to prepare and peak for the Summer Olympics in Tokyo, what are they going to do for the next year? I mean, and I think the smart thing would be to try to get that edge, and change something. Everyone has their own little weaknesses and their own small areas of the court where they're maybe a little bit less consistent and things break down a little bit more. But now they have a whole year to possibly redefine a little bit of their games, and that's a risk. I don't know if you guys follow golf at all, but I don't really. But I mean, the stories I hear about Tiger Woods, changing his game, completely changing the swing. Like, I've heard a lot that was not the best move. I mean, he made that consciously, and that was just, again, a risk that he took in doing that. He said, I have to. Fair enough. Like, I'm not questioning that, but there's always, that risk reward, and our players just going to keep doing the same thing that's given them that success until now, until the next summer for the Tokyo Games, or are they going to take that risk? And I think that's really going to be just an interesting thing to see. I mentioned the women's singles because I know Michelle Lee very well, and being our top player from Canada and having worked with her for a couple of years on the national squad, but also I think the women's singles field is just so open. I mean, really, you have just 8 different women who could possibly win that big tournament.
Yeah, which is fantastic to actually have the opportunity to watch when the time comes, because it's anybody's game when it's really those top 8 women's players in those high level competitions. Certainly, there are some big key names like you mentioned, Tai Tzu Ying, right at the top there. That tends to outperform a lot. And Andrew, I think you've kind of summed up what high-level badminton is. I know it's kind of this really sort of grey term, because once you've reached high-level badminton, it's just a lot of grey areas to the amount and level of players that are actually involved in high-level badminton, and every sort of advantage they bring with their own game. And I guess it's hard, as you said, to redefine yourself as a professional badminton player, or continue to improve when you're already at that high level, right? So for you, if I were to ask you, for example, if I was a high level badminton player, where would I start? How would I approach maintaining my high level? And how can I redefine myself if that was the next step that I needed to take to reach a higher level in that broad high level badminton category?
Yeah, that's also a super good question. So, well, I think that if I had to sort of summarize what I've learned as a coach and as a player from the last sort of 20 years now of doing the coaching and high level badminton, I would have to say that there's just a lot of pushback from people in general to take those risks. And I think that's really at the crux of, why you see players just plateau. I mean, everybody sort of has that quick improvement at the beginning, and then at some point you plateau, and it's sort of that how quickly and how far you go up, as I mentioned earlier, to me is partially and to a large extent based on building up enough of that foundation of high level technique and skill set. There are, of course, the other factors physically, psychologically, tactically. And if I had to actually, really put sort of a larger emphasis on one area, I mean, it would probably have to be from that psychological side, because it's sort of all related to, like, are you going to take that risk or not? So that's kind of part of it. That's one piece of it. And then the other piece of that would be probably to do with with asking yourself, I mean, are you making the right choices and the best choices? And, that sort of, there's a lot of, to be a successful athlete, you have to have ego, you have to have confidence, you have to be, like the very best athletes, a lot of them are these super A-type personalities, like nothing is going to stand in my way. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm just following my own path, my own judgment. And there's no doubt, or very little doubt outwardly anyway. And they just go with a decision and they go 100% all in. And, obviously what makes them successful is that they're good at assessing a situation correctly. Their judgment is generally more sound than, let's say, a lower ranked player of equal skill and all that stuff. So, what separates those best athletes are generally better choices. And so I think it's kind of, when you ask that question, it's sort of that comes to mind, where it's like, from my experience, I've had so many conversations with athletes that you really should change this. You really should. And, it's really hard to convince somebody to change, to say, because in doing so, they're accepting that they're somehow flawed, that they're somehow bad at whatever thing we're addressing or talking about. And so it's really, for me, again, if I look at, those top athletes, and I'm sure they are having coaches who are critically assessing, where you made your mistakes, where your opponent was able to beat you in those, and it's so subtle. It's so like, at the top level, it's really hard to spot, the trends, unless you're really having a statistician looking at, over 10 matches. And I know that some of the best countries have that. Spoke with one guy from Korea, one guy from Malaysia, who their jobs were just literally to do the stats. But even there, it's not on the same level as what you see in baseball in the United States. I mean, that they've had a long history of, like, it's a very structured sport, so you can really count, how many strikes were thrown and how many hits, and so and they just can go so deep into the stats and just really pick out where the strengths and weaknesses lie. But I think that's really just to summarize, like that comes down to, is the player willing to change? And, most people and players aren't. And I think the best ones, can, and they are just, it's nothing to do with ego. It's just, I want results. And then, if you sort of spin it that way, most people be like, oh, of course I'll change. But then, once they have to do the work to actually change those choices, I think that's where it gets really, really challenging, sort of to change your mindset, and, to go from being maybe more pessimistic to more optimistic, whatever the weakness is, and, and why the athlete isn't achieving. So I don't know if I exactly answered in the way that you were hoping, but that sort of opened up that direction of thought for me.
Yeah, I don't think there is just an answer to that. Otherwise, it's like the $1 million question, right? Like, how do you get them to change when they don't want to change, or what do they actually change themselves? And I just want to reiterate what you said, Andrew, which was that the top players there, the weaknesses, as you call them, are so subtle that it's not like lower level badminton where it's just like hit to the backhand, right? The typical just hit to the backhand, they have no backhand, or they can't change their grip or something. It's at such a high level that I feel that even with those stats, like, how does a player such as, let's just use Michelle as an example, right? Because she's a very top women's singles player, but she doesn't really have that infrastructure and that access to that heavy stats, like someone counting the shots that she's hitting from here and here. So how hard is it for a player to actually know what their weakness is? Like, of course you can feel it, but then if you've got numbers to back them up, it's so much clearer as to what you need to do, right? But then for someone who doesn't have those stats to back them up, then how is it that, other than asking your coach, is there another way that you think that you can look at, okay, I need to improve this part of my game? Because it might not even feel like a weakness to you. And then when you look at the numbers, then you think, oh, wow, it is a weakness, because the numbers tell a story themselves.
Yeah, that's another. Yeah, we're getting into the deep questions of being successful at the top level of badminton. So, Yeah. So to answer that, without a statistician who's sitting down and helping you map out, the reality of those things, I can say one of the big challenges, what makes a lot of top athletes amazing is their instincts. But instincts don't always correlate to awareness. So it's like, a lot of, I've had tons of conversations with athletes. How do you do that? And it's like, oh, it's just a feeling, like I just do it. And, they can't really explain what they're doing. I was sort of more of the, analytical mind in my own head. And so, I wanted to know exactly like the mechanics that went into all of these different shots, and, frustrating my coaches from time to time, because, there's a point where that's just too much. Like, you just need to hit.
Hit the thing.
Yeah. So there's that balance there. But in terms of going back to that Michelle Lee example, I really think resources is a huge thing. I mean, I haven't talked with her in a long time. I know that recently she was on your podcast, right?
Yeah, we haven't really. Yeah, by the time this episode releases, hers would have been out. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So hers isn't out at time of recording quite yet.
Okay, so I look forward to hearing from her mouth maybe some of the answers to some of those types of questions. But that being said, it would be. I'm not working with her anymore, but the question I would ask her is like, where is the biggest hole in your game? And if it is regarding this tactical thing versus a technical thing versus a physical thing versus some psychological thing, these are all big questions, like how do you break through? And, and she's starting to, as we've seen, it's just been like it's a long process to break through when you haven't been there. You've been there, but like, now you've gotten one win against a top player. Now you've gotten a couple of wins now, and it starts to sort of steamroll. And, she's still at this young age where she's not yet at that plateau. She's still able to garner some minutia of improvement that's going to help her to kind of gain that confidence. And, the really exciting thing is that we've seen her beating these top players. And, but going back to that, she would need to then just say, like, it's allocation of resources, like, where am I spending my money? And, is there a better way to in the ideal world, we, as athletes, as success is hugely correlated with being able to travel to enough tournaments, get enough lessons and coaching from good people, and so on.
Team,
so
right?
It's really,
yep,
exactly. Yeah. I don't know if it's the same terminology in Australia, but in Canada, it's IST, Integrated Service Team. Integrated Support Team.
Support team.
Yeah.
So when you do listen to that one, there is a bit about that, about allocation of resources and what's worked for her, what she's tried, what she hasn't tried, and very much a trial and error thing for her, because of course there are limited resources. So she needs to do certain things to figure out what the return on that investment was, and then basically make decisions from there. But if we move on now, Andrew, I know we're still on the topic of high level badminton, but being a player, what are the differences between yourself as a player? Because when you're a player, it is about, I guess, about the ego part. It's all about me, right? It's kind of like, what do I need to do to be better? What am I doing to be better than this person? What aren't I doing? It's always about I, me. So if you were going to look back at, say, athlete Andrew, what would your definition of this high-level badminton, what are the most important things as a player? And then when you're now a coach, have those things changed, in your opinion, as to what it takes or what's really important to be this high-level player?
Yes, they have. So definitely as a player, and then being a coach working in that environment, communication skills have to be, that's a critical. You have to be able to get the message across, and you have to, and that's where, I've seen several examples of former top players in the world who maybe, didn't have as much success as you would expect with their knowledge, with their body of knowledge, the breadth of knowledge that they have. And of course, I'm not going to name any names, although it would be exciting to get into some stories. But no, I've seen a couple of examples of that where basically because of just poor communication skills and a bit too much ego, they just push the people near them away. And I think being able to just put your ego aside and just emphasize, and it's difficult. I mean, many times I struggle with, I'm sure this is a common former player turned coach thing where you're watching your players struggling to do something and, you right away want to show them, no, this is how you do it. Like, see, it's easy. Like this, this type of thing. It's like sometimes that, that impatience might pop into your mind. I've struggled with that from time to time, but I think definitely to be successful is you really need to put your vision into that athlete and sort of see it from their viewpoint, and then try to work with where they're going with that path. And that just takes a lot of communication. And I think, I've seen, you can be successful as a coach with both paths, by the way, like this extremely, you're going to do what I say and this is going to make you successful. And the other way, which is very athlete driven. And I'm a very athlete driven, like for me as an athlete, it was all about, like I did not like a coach telling me like, you have to do it this way. I'd like a coach to explain it to me and let me decide, if I'm going to utilize that or not. And so I think that's sort of more my style. And I think that is at that top level. I am quite sure that Lin Dan is not, accepting you're going to do this way. And,
Definitely
I'm sure he's
not anymore. Not anymore anyway.
Yeah. I've seen, like hundreds of thousands of matches of his, hundreds to thousands of matches of his over the years. And, when you look at every coaching interval, very few times is he like, yes. The eyes wide open, like I will do as you say, like, like he's just filtering, he's staying in his own bubble and then he's performing. And so it's like, I think that is really the challenge is just to, the athletes have their goals and dreams and you're trying to just give them skills and build skills, challenge them to build more skill. When I say skill, like I mean broadly across all of those physical, psychological, tactical, technical areas, and then support them, like unconditionally. Like everyone needs to have that person, as you mentioned at the very beginning. Like you summarized very well. Like it's just having that team of people that are just going to inspire you, going to push you, and no matter what the situation, right?
Yeah. And when you just mentioned Lin Dan, I'm just picturing back to all the games that I've watched him where he's just sort of staring straight direct, like in a direct line of sight away from anybody else. He's just so focused. He's just in the zone, and there's just nothing going through him. But I'm sure there is plenty going through him, and he's filtering out what he needs to perform and win and play at his best. But yeah, you highlighted something that I think is really fascinating, Andrew, and I've heard it, speaking to other coaches, is that sort of that two-way street between the coach and player, that relationship, and that there's not really a one-size-fits-all for that, for the type of coaching that's required to help develop players properly. And then like yourself, you seem like a very detail-oriented and very technical kind of player that you want all that information, etc. And I think that for a coach to coach you, that you would really like all that detail. And whereas there might be someone that needs something else, needs the support, needs the confidence. It really depends on the player themselves. So I think, it's really important to cater that coaching to the type of player where they're at and what they really need to develop further. And
Absolutely.
Andrew, maybe you've touched on this already, but I wanted to ask you. I mean, since you've been playing high-level badminton, you've been coaching high-level badminton, and through your work with the Swiss and Canadian teams, I mean, is there anything in particular, or your key few things that you have learnt in this, I guess, this journey of yours that you would like to share with us and the audience?
Yeah, lessons learned. I mean, I really think that it just comes down to, there's quite a few. Wow, there's a lot of hard lessons that I've learned. Maybe that will have to be, maybe that's an intro to a second podcast in
second episode
time, but where we can get into stories. But I really think just the communication thing is just so critical, and to really be able to harness the motivation and the skills of the people around you. And I think that's, if there's one area where I've failed as a coach, would be really spending that extra time to convince and educate parents as one, like when we're talking about coaching younger players. I mean, that's where maybe the ego sometimes got in the way, where it's like, hey, I'm a really good coach here. I was a former Olympian and I'm coaching your son or daughter. You should just be happy with what,
listen to me.
Like with them being in this environment, like this is just a great environment for your child. And, I might have had a bit of that standoffishness, slightly. Like I don't think I'm a very standoffish person, but like there might have been that vibe from time to time where, instantly the parent was like, well, why is he not explaining to me, like, or just, when a parent said like, hey, does my son or daughter have, do they have what it takes? Like when they asked that question, of course I would be like, I'm a big believer that it really comes down to what the player wants. If the player wants to be good, they can get fairly good. But, often parents look at it like, are they good now? Are they going to be good in a year? And if the answer is no, then maybe that means they don't have the potential, and they don't, and so it's trying to really spend enough time to really get to the root of what they're looking for. Because, often basically the final outcome was that parent would be not really taking the sport seriously in terms of the kid's eyes and in the kid's eyes, and maybe wouldn't support the kid through, 5 or 6 years in a program. And I think that's, for me, that's the biggest, like, it's okay if a kid wants to stop playing badminton, no problem. Like if that's really what they want, but when it comes from what the parents are pushing them to do, because that lack of communication or that little bit of standoffishness, perhaps, that I gave, then that's a failure in my mind as a coach, and so, that's sort of, it sort of revolves around this communication. And I think, once we are spending enough time, and then, it's exhaustive, being, getting into that level of detail with, now you're working with several athletes and several families of those athletes. And so it's kind of like, it's exhaustive, but it's important, because, only then can you really like learn to go in the best direction with that athlete. And, you might find that some might drop off sooner, because once you finally get to the truth of what the child is looking for, it's not really this elite badminton thing, for example. And so, I think that's really, if I had to choose one thing, I think that would really be the biggest thing, is just like this ability to communicate and to, get everyone on the same page so that everything can move forward in the optimal way.
Yeah. No, I when you started talking about parents asking, hey, does my son or daughter have what it takes? And I just want to touch on that briefly, because what it takes is such a subjective thing. And even if someone does have what it takes, in quotation marks for the people who can't see me, it doesn't mean that they will take it, right? There are so many athletes you hear about, success stories, who have been told that they didn't have what it takes, and they've made it and have done awesome things. And there have been so many athletes who have been told that they have what it takes, and they just don't make it as well. So having what it takes, while it's probably very comforting for the parent to know and think, okay, this is a worthwhile thing to be doing, I don't think that just knowing that you've got what it takes is enough. There's so much more to it than just a coach saying, hey, your son or daughter has what it takes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that you sort of, explained that brilliantly. I mean, that's, it's this sort of the idea of talent, and, everyone loves when they hear that their child is talented. And, but it's still, it's still in the end, there's just so many factors. And I mean, for me, it just comes down to the decision of, do I want it? And am I willing to do what it takes to get it? And I think that's usually where you see more of a drop off, people with talent, quote unquote, as we've seen, you probably have a ton of examples in Australia of young talented athletes who, quote unquote, had what it took. Yep. but for whatever reason, they didn't decide to keep going, or they didn't break through, and So it's a very complex thing, and I think communication is just helping to sift through, to get more to the root of where we want to go and how we want to do things in a better way. I think that's, for all things in life, I think that's pretty important.
Yeah. And Andrew, if you were going to think about, so as a coach, I'm sure you would have had your fair share of people who do drop out from the sport, right? So they might be trying to reach this really high level, but then maybe they don't feel like they've got it, or maybe they don't want it, or maybe they just decide that they'll drop out. But what do you think the most common reason is that players tend to say give up when they're trying to reach that high level? What do you think the biggest barrier is for them? And then what do you say to them when they're on the brink of making this decision to stop? Is there something that you say to them to encourage them to make a certain decision? Or?
Well, that's, again, as I mentioned, like, unfortunately, I've had it where the athletes are stopping and didn't have that conversation with me to the level that I would have hoped. Let's just put it that way. Like, I would have hoped that, a year before that, we could have had that conversation that, like, hey, if this is really not going well, or even if it is going well, like, what, I've had athletes asking questions, and, and then, 6 months later they're stopping. And so it's like, you didn't give me a chance to try to convince you. Come on. Like, this frustration that kind of, and sadness that kind of comes with that, where it's like, but I think there's just so many factors. I mean, there's this long life, and there's this pressure to have to make a life for yourself and earn enough money and be independent. And I think, when all of those things aren't matching up for long enough, then I think that's where you start to see, drop off of athletes, where it's like, okay, so I've done this couple of years of investment. When is this going to lead to something a bit bigger? It doesn't necessarily, like for most people, it doesn't necessarily have to lead to something huge, but it's like, okay, are you going to keep living at home until you're 35? Or, like at some point, I'm sure that player who's, 28 living at home, in a lot of cases, they're going to get that question of like, so what are we doing here? Like, what are you going to do once this is over? And, my biggest thing, I mean, as an athlete, and this is, again, my sort of stubbornness, and maybe partly why I was a bit successful, is like, my answer to that as a 16, 17-year-old is like, I'm prepared to take the risk that if I am unsuccessful in this career, and even in the worst case that I have to work in McDonald's for the rest of my life, like I want to take this chance. Like I was genuinely in that mindset where it was like, I realized at a young age, like we're lucky enough, we live in fairly wealthy countries, and you don't starve to death in our country. And, and conversely, in some of the other badminton nations, which are very successful, badminton is a way to actually get out of poverty. Yeah. And I think that's why we see so much success coming from some of those countries. But for me, it was really just like, I'm prepared to risk a lot because I love this so much. And I think I can be successful. And, in my mind, it wasn't a huge risk. So that's probably part of the reason why I was so happy, okay to say it. But like, But still, I genuinely sort of felt that as a 17, 18-year-old. And I think for me, that's, partly why I was successful, is that I was willing to do enough years of potential struggle where maybe I would have success, maybe not, but I wasn't going to let, just like one bad year, like I had my fair share of bad years in those beginning years where it wasn't always, the perfect results. I had my first year that I won the Open Nationals. The next year I lost in the quarterfinals, and this was after I had moved to Denmark and spent a year training in Denmark. So, coming back after a year training in Denmark and then losing in the quarterfinals of the Nationals, people were like, whoa, you just invested all this money to go to Denmark and now you're not successful and you didn't win the Nationals, and maybe you should rethink this school thing. Like so I had a lot of that type of pressure, and I think, I think just being able to, as a coach now, like just being able to have enough conversations with an athlete and open conversations, where the athlete isn't keeping those things to themselves. I think that's just such a critical thing in our environments. Like when I'm thinking about Switzerland, where being a pro badminton player is not the common thing to do. Canada, the same thing. It's like it requires a huge investment by the parents, and it's not the normal path. And as long as the parents are okay with, like just giving the child whatever life they dream of and supporting it, then it can be successful. But as soon as that's not really the path, then I think it, quickly breaks down. And that's why we see most people, that path isn't for most people, because it is so energy resource intensive. And I think that sort of sums it up.
Yeah, it sums it up perfectly, Andrew. I think it really comes back to what you and Jeff both discussed earlier. It's that question of, do you have what it takes versus are you willing to do what it takes? And the differentiation between those two. And because the question, do you have what it takes, is such a vague and open question with so many complicating factors. When you do ask it, it's kind of like you're not really asking it to get an answer. You're kind of just asking it for yourself, being the parent, rather than asking it for your child. I think personally, as an opinion. But yeah, having what it takes and doing what it takes are two very different things. And you've really summed it up really well there, Andrew. So thank you for that. Now, Andrew, we're coming up to the end of our podcast, but I wanted to ask you if there is anything else that we should have asked you, but we haven't yet.
That's a really
is that a hard
well,
one?
I'm a pretty private person, Henry. So basically, I mean, if you get me in a conversation, I'm Canadian. I'm comfortable talking to somebody on the bus and getting into a conversation with them and telling them, obviously, that I'm a badminton coach and all this stuff. But is there anything else? I think that basically, there would be just lots of stories. I mean, for me, I'm blessed that I was able to do this badminton thing and, go down this path. And again, as we sort of mentioned with regards to my peers, like, they probably looked at me with just as much jealousy or envy, or that lifestyle that I was leading is very cool. I mean, it was very cool. I loved traveling. I loved the fact that it was done, on the cheap, let's just say, like staying in hostels. Like that was for me, one of the funnest things was like, how cheap can I make this trip? Inexpensive, and how could I improve as much as possible on whatever budget I had. And so I think for me, those were, just some of the most wonderful times that I was able, and, like I got the support from my parents to do that. And, I was able to make the tiniest bit of money to get by. But, just to give some background, like I did live at home until I was, I had these 4 years that I spent in Denmark from 20 to 23. And then after that, I moved back home. And so, in my mid 20s, I was living at home. And then at the end of my career, I was also living at home, you know, in my late 30s, or sorry, my late 20s, I was also at home for a bit. So it was like, you know, you have to make certain sacrifices. But again, as I mentioned at the very beginning and middle part here, that that was my thing. I have my goals, and like, I don't care if I have to live in a sleeping bag, like sleep in a sleeping bag in a tent in my mom's backyard. Like, I didn't have to do that. But if she said, you know, you're not living with me, okay, can I live in your backyard? Like, that was
you would have camped out there. Yeah,
I would have camped out there. So awesome. Yeah, for me, that was the adventure. I mean, that's like, you know, this is the modern day Lord of the Rings adventure, where you're just like fighting for something good, and, you know, like you're just on this adventure all the time and traveling and getting some interesting perspectives. So I think, yeah, those are some of just the crazy great opportunities that I was able to have, is just give that perspective of traveling and meeting other people like Jeff. You know, yeah, I consider you a friend. We haven't kept in the best touch, and that's mostly my fault. But yeah, I think everyone's gotten busy with their lives ever since they've retired as players. But you know, like, I really appreciate that I got to meet all these nice people on tour and share in the same thing, you know, together. And you know, that really was, you know, forgetting all the successes and failures, like, that is such a huge part of the whole experience.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And that is such a great thing about badminton, is just the community that you build, even if it's not on the professional scene, but also on a social level, and weekly playing. If you're playing at your weekly club, there's just so much. Yeah. It's good for your health. It's good for your socializing, and you just meet lots of cool people. So, Andrew, we are coming to the end of this podcast now, but before we basically wrap up here, I'm going to ask you for just 3 little bits of advice. So 3 top things that you would say to a player who is perhaps on the brink of getting to that higher level. So they're training hard, they're doing what they can. Maybe they're not in a national team yet. Maybe they're not quite in a state team, but they're pushing their boundaries and trying to make those levels so they can be selected in these teams. If you had 3 quick pieces of advice to give, what would you give them?
I think number 1 is just be critical / honest of yourself. I think that number 1 is just being able to assess your strengths and weaknesses and be honest about those things, because as soon as you know what's weak and you start working at it, I mean, within a short period of time, those weaknesses become a lot less weak, and you sort of see the success kind of happen immediately, assuming you continue to work on your strengths. I mean, it's very easy to get focused on the weaknesses and forget the strengths. But you know, I think that's number 1. Number 2 is you've got to just be fitter. I've seen so many singles players on the international badminton tour who just are having certain skill set, but just are not fit enough. And I think understanding and just reading a book about sport physiology, it could be just changing your life in terms of understanding that badminton, while being a very high speed, explosive sport, you know, still utilizes endurance and your aerobic systems. And so understanding the relationships there, and that you actually need to go for these slow jogs, you know, to build endurance, and have these slower sessions to you know, where you're doing a lot of more volume, but at a lower intensity. I think that's sort of part of it, where I've seen a lot of players just not have enough endurance to, you know, they can get the one-off win, but then they don't have the endurance to recover then for the next match and get through a tournament. Because ultimately, I mean, if you want to get further, you have to have the skills. You have to be able to get one win first, but later on, you need to be fit enough to be able to do several. And I think that's sort of be fit enough and train hard, but understand the physiology, that there are, you know, there's other aspects of training that actually might help you optimize that speed. You know, like doing the slow runs can actually help you manage that. You can do, instead of 8 repeats of a 400 meter, you can maybe, after several months of building endurance, you can do 12. And so things like that. And number 3 is just, I think that lesson is just, you have to just be willing to go through long enough, and longer than, you know, just as long as it takes to be successful. Because, you know, it's such an intangible thing, sport and success, that you just can't say, I'm just going to do it for 1 year and see what happens. It's got to be like, I have a goal, and I'm going to take if it takes 1.5 years to achieve that goal or 2 years to achieve that goal in terms of the level, I think that you just need to not be holding yourself back by just setting timelines. Are good for challenging yourself, but I mean, to be a good badminton player, I mean, if that happens in 3 years or 2.5 years, and you set 2.5 years as your target, and you weren't there yet, well, you're just going to quit, or like, it just, to me, those are the sort of the three main things. Sorry, that wasn't very short, but those are my 3 rules.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect for everyone listening out there, just getting clarity on what you want to achieve. So thank you, Andrew. And Andrew, is there, if listeners out there were wanting more of this golden advice, is there anywhere in particular that they can hit you up, connect with you, or ask a question? Is there anywhere that they can find you?
I think the best place, unfortunately, don't have a website of my own or Instagram or anything like that. I'm still old school, of the old school generation who hasn't upgraded yet. But I love email. So Andrew at yonex.ch. And that's my email address at Yonex Switzerland. So I'm more than happy to answer questions and to start a conversation, because I really love talking about badminton, as you guys can tell, and we're all passionate about this. And if somebody has a genuine interest in knowing something, I would not say no. So please email me, Andrew at yonex.ch.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. And just from everyone listening, and Henry and myself, Andrew, just want to say thanks so much for being on this episode of the Badminton Podcast.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, guys.
So for everyone out there listening, make sure you do take Andrew's awesome advice. There's so many take-home key messages that you can start using in your life, and not just in your sport, but just in your life in general. Any life goals you have, whether it's career, academics, sports, relationships, etc., finances, you can really apply a lot of these principles to your life. And that's what the Badminton Podcast is all about, pushing you to grow as a player and as a person as well. So if you have enjoyed this episode, would love it if you did share it with your family, your friends, other players, your community, because there's so much to be gained from it. And it's really going to help us to achieve our goal at the Badminton Podcast and Volant, which is to really bring the community together and show the world how incredible badminton is, because it is awesome. We love it. And Andrew, you love it as well.
I certainly do. Thank you.
Yeah. And what I really wanted to do in the last couple of minutes was to summarize this episode, but there's just so many good things that have come out of this episode and so many valuable takeaways. I think if I were to try and summarize what I've learned and what Andrew has imparted on me in this episode, I would definitely say being resourceful. I know we didn't use the word resourceful, but resourcefulness is really important as a player. So make sure, even if you are a player in an area where you don't have the infrastructure or support out there, that you are being resourceful, and so that you can still develop into a world-class player like Andrew, as well as being adaptable. We didn't really talk about the word adaptable, but it has come through in a lot of what Andrew has said today as well. So adaptability is really important. And then finally, I'd say, Andrew talked briefly about setting some clear objectives. And just like Jeff said, our mission here is to show the world how incredible badminton is. That is our objective. Whether we hit it in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, we don't know, but we're going to keep trying. So hopefully, the people that are listening, the audience out there, that they really enjoyed this episode. So yes, make sure you share this episode. And if you want to connect with us, you can connect with us via Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Although we don't do much on TikTok, we're a bit old school there as well, I guess, just like you, Andrew. But you can connect with us with our social media handle at Volantwear, VOLANTWEAR, or you can find us on our website, www.volantwear.com. We're super excited to bring you more episodes going forward. And we'd love for you guys out there to reach out to us if you have any questions at all. Okay. So we will see you on the very next episode. Thanks so much for listening again. And thank you again, Andrew, for being on our podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you, Henry.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video podcast, please make sure you like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. You can also find the link to the audio podcast in the description below. And as always, let's show the world how incredible badminton is.